The fall of Rome is one of the most prominent topics in all of history, with a detailed historiography going back almost to the fall itself. It's a very dynamic period with a great deal of continuity and change. Many people and nations have claimed to be legitimate continuations of the Roman state, which if explored can make what seems like a clear factual question far more interesting. I want to ask then, when, if at all, did the Roman Empire fall? When people talk about the fall of Rome, they generally mean the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD, but I think it's important to consider keeping the ideas of Rome and the West separate. So, here we have a basic timeline of Roman decline. Augustus dissolved the Republic and founded the Empire in 27 BC, and while the Roman Republic was already recognisably Roman to a modern reader, Augustus' reforms put the last few finishing touches on to turn it into the empire of gold and marble we think of when we hear Rome in the popular conscience. Fast forward a century or so and Trajan dies in 117 AD, having waged Rome's last successful wars of conquest and expanded the empire to her greatest extent. At this point the Colosseum has been built, for instance, and things are still going incredibly strong. His successor Hadrian would build the wall across the northern border of Britain. Another century later, the crisis of the 3rd century begins, a period of civil strife and constant rival claimants, which shook the empire to its core, with many territories threatening secession. Huge amounts of Roman blood and money were expended, and without a doubt the empire was never the same afterwards. The crisis was so persistent it lasted more or less until Diocletian took the throne, and in 293 AD he split the empire into eastern and western halves for administrative purposes. Diocletian believed the empire was too big and complex for any one man to govern, and thought that splitting the duty was the best way to overcome this. This period also saw the move away from the classical principate, in which the emperor was supposedly first among equals, into the dominate, a different style of government which looks as much like early medieval kingship as it does old Roman rule. People were subjects as much as they were citizens, and the emperors demanded to be referred to as dominus, meaning lord. Following this, in 324 AD, Constantine became emperor, temporarily reuniting the two halves of the empire, converting it to Christianity, and building a new capital which would come to be called Constantinople, modern Istanbul. This new city was closer to Rome's greatest rivals in Persia, and on a crossroads of trade across the empire. In time it would eclipse Rome itself, and it was not long before Constantinople became the more important of the two capitals. Then in 476 we have the traditional date for the fall of Rome, when the Ostrogoths, a Germanic tribe, invaded Italy and deposed the last Western Roman emperor, dissolving the empire in the west. Until, that is, Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800. Many of these dates have been called the beginning of the end, the death of Trajan and the end of conquest, the crisis of the 3rd century irreversibly shaking the empire, Diocletian's division into two self-interested halves, Constantine's removal of the old Roman religion, and most significantly, the Ostrogothic invasion in 476. In particular, these are often discussed in relation to the Dark Ages which would follow the fall of the West, and historians like to talk about when the Roman Empire looks less like it did in its classical heyday and more like an indicator of the medieval world in future. I think there's more to it than that, however, and it's useful to think about the later Roman period as a transformation of the Roman world as much as it is a destruction of it. Let's think then about Rome in her prime. What made Rome Roman? Well, we might first think about the high level of material and artistic sophistication in the Roman world. Sculptures, paintings, clothing, tools and furniture, all of the material things which make up the aesthetic, the feel of the Roman world. Rome was characterised by a firm, consistent legal system, and an efficient, bureaucratic government, only possible because of Rome's high literacy. This made it easy for the Romans to keep calendars, for traders to keep record books, and for a mountain of paperwork to transport goods and people where they were needed. That, in turn, led to very high levels of trade across a European and Mediterranean world, which was far more connected then than it had ever been before, and arguably has been since. A century ago, coriander might have been an exotic herb to have seen in English cooking, for instance, and yet nearly 2,000 years ago we see coriander seeds in the latrines on Hadrian's Wall. Spanish olive oil went to Greece in exchange for fine marble, and Egyptian grain fed the urban sprawl in Italy, a sprawl which was itself characteristic of the Roman world. Rome, in comparison to what had come before it, and certainly what came after, was a very urbanised society, with large cities of high population across Italy and the rest of the empire. London, Colchester, Milan, Tarraco, Alexandria, Constantinople, Damascus, the list really does go on and on. Perhaps the most famous characteristic of the Roman Empire, however, was the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. The empire controlled an enormous amount of land across 3 continents, and within that land, the imperial heyday was marked by a remarkable peace and stability, the likes of which we've not seen since. From Augustus' accession to the throne until almost the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome's territories were entirely free of conflict away from the borders. A strong argument could be made that this peace is what allowed such trade, such urbanisation and prosperity to flourish at all, and regardless led to a greatly improved quality of life for millions in what was otherwise quite a warlike time. Finally, and most controversially, we have Christianity. While Rome initially persecuted Christians, they gradually gained more influence within the empire until Constantine's conversion, and from that point the Romans took their usual bureaucratic attitude to matters of belief, holding conference after conference to establish written articles of faith, and making Christianity as much a Roman religion as that which it had overturned. In fact, in many parts of Europe, Rome's most enduring legacy was Christianity, and a survival of Christianity can easily be interpreted as a survival of Roman spirit. Let's step back a bit and talk about the crisis of the 3rd century. By the time of the crisis, the empire hadn't expanded for over a century, which, for a state so reliant on conquest, was a big problem. Roman soldiers received land in newly conquered areas as part of their pensions, and if there was no more conquering, that meant a bunch of unhappy legionaries wanting to be provided for in some way or another. This and other factors led to the army becoming more and more impactful in politics, often being the single deciding factor in who would succeed the current emperor. And they needed to be watched and paid off constantly to make sure the threat they posed didn't spill over into open conflict. Roman currency began to decline in value, as subsequent emperors kept minting more to pay their armies higher and higher wages, which did lead to some financial trouble. That said, the Pax Romana still held up, trade flowed across the empire, and it was still prosperous in a similar way to how it had been 200 years earlier. The crisis changed this, perhaps for good. It led to a huge decline in urban population as people fled vulnerable cities to move to the countryside, and fundamentally changed the relations of production as a result. Many poor people moved to aristocratic landed estates and tied themselves and their labour to the land in exchange for protection and accommodation, essentially giving rise to the class who would become the peasants, so characteristic of medieval society. Trade was greatly lessened as the Mediterranean became contested, and bandits, some of whom were deserting soldiers, lined the Roman roads which had so famously connected the continent. This period also saw a massive amount of bloodletting, with Roman men being slaughtered in droves in these civil conflicts. This peace, once broken, could not be remade, and even after the crisis was over, civil war became the new preferred method of choosing a new emperor. Rome's manpower really suffered as a result, which led to military weakness in future and the reintroduction of harsher conscription, further threatening the lives and health of everyday people. Some say the crisis was the death blow to the empire, creating structural problems which would bear themselves out over the coming centuries, and they may well be right. Diocletian's division of the empire did not do it any favours either. Sometimes after him, the west and east would be reunited under one emperor, like Constantine, but this was the exception, not the rule, and while the 2 emperors were supposed to work together for the good of Rome, there was as much competition, passive aggression, and even open war at times as there was meaningful cooperation. As a result of this division, we move here from Trajan's united and strong empire in 117 AD to this split of east and west, which continued long after Diocletian right to the end of the Western Empire. The date given here is 395 AD, but these borders remained mostly static until the fall of the West. The geography of these two represents another set of problems, which would allow the East to pull ahead of the West. First of all, the East is a far richer region, with a much longer history of classical civilization, and far higher pre-existing urbanization, with very agriculturally productive regions like the Nile. Also, the West had far longer European borders, while the East only had a relatively small front on the Danube to look after. All these factors meant that a divided empire was always going to see the West struggling to keep up with the East. As the years dragged on, and the empire wasted its manpower fighting itself, Rome began to federate barbarian tribes from outside their borders, promising them safe settlement of land within the empire in exchange for providing the Roman army with soldiers and expert local generals, and allowing their children to be educated as Romans. They essentially agreed to become Roman subjects, and most of them were okay with this. The different Germanic peoples had been living near the borders for centuries, and were well exposed to Roman culture. They knew what it had to offer, and at least some of them wanted to share in this. Unfortunately, Rome either couldn't afford to reward them, refused to do so, or both, and placed these barbarian soldiers on their front lines, essentially as the most disposable part of the army. Many of these groups then turned inwards towards imperial territory, fighting Roman soldiers for the territory they'd been promised. At this point, some of them were vehemently anti-Roman, but many still claimed membership of the empire. As far as they were concerned, they weren't invaders at all. They'd signed an agreement and were Roman subjects like anyone else, simply resisting the aggression of their new government, and, to an extent, they were right. Regardless of their intent or justification, incursions into Roman land became common. Cities shrank and built walls for the first time in centuries as people fled to the countryside, and Rome was sacked twice before it was eventually conquered, once by the Visigoths and again by the Vandals. These Germanic tribes brought their own pagan practices and gods, but many did quickly convert to Christianity, and a strong Roman cultural and civil presence survived in pockets, interspersed with barbarism. As such, we come to the Roman world on the fall of the West, with a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, most notably the Visigoths controlling a huge swathe of modern Spain and France, the Franks around the Belgium area, who would go on to become incredibly important, and Odoacer's Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. There are two Roman rump states, one controlled by a general called Syagrius in northern France, and one along the Adriatic coast, controlled by former Western Emperor Julius Nepos. Don't forget, however, that even as the West fell and the Dark Ages rolled over Europe, the eastern half of the empire survived, and even thrived in the coming centuries. As much as our Western-centric view might tell us Roman civilization was dead, it really wasn't. If we skip just over 300 years forward, however, to the year 800, Europe looks entirely different. The Eastern Roman Empire, called the Byzantine Empire after the ancient Greek city Byzantium on which Constantinople was built, had been stripped of its Egyptian and Middle Eastern possessions, and the Bulgars were conquering right through the heartland of the empire. The Pope had his own sovereign territory with Rome as his capital, ruling up central Italy, and the biggest change is the expansion of the Franks, from controlling a small territory around Belgium to most of Western Europe, surrounded by the light blue states which were their subjects. The Franks had expanded to cover much of modern France and the Benelux in the intervening centuries, but most of their expansion beyond that point was the work of one man, Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Charles the Great, and great he was. A Roman Catholic king of the Franks, he was the first hegemon the West had seen since the Western emperors. He protected the Roman faith, fighting holy wars against Spanish Muslims, against Italian Lombards to protect the Pope, and against pagan Slavs in the East. He reintroduced state schools and education, turning back the tide of illiteracy which had swept the continent since the fall of the West. He encouraged a great artistic and cultural flourishing, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, and radically reformed and reorganised government within Europe, away from a personal military rule and towards a state with majesty and legal rights. He restored Roman glory to the western provinces, and in 800 AD on Christmas Day was rewarded for his efforts by the Pope, who crowned him Holy Roman Emperor, over 300 years since the title had been used outside of Constantinople. Some argue, however, that he was not the Roman he is portrayed as being. After all, his Holy Roman Empire was distinct from the Old Roman Empire, and was instead a German entity, which would go on to be famously decried by Voltaire as neither holy nor Roman. The Franks had come from outside the empire centuries ago to take swathes of land, and fought plenty of battles against Roman soldiers and cities. They had strained relations even with other Germanic foederati, with the Pope until recently before Charlemagne, and with the Eastern Roman Empire. Roman infrastructure barely survived in continental Europe, and its culture was buried for centuries, with its imitation under the barbarian successors a poor mockery of its original form. Despite being called Holy Roman Emperor, the majority of Western land remained outside of Charlemagne's control, and he was crowned by a pope with no secular authority. Popes had never crowned emperors before. Not only this, but a Roman emperor still existed in the East, centuries after the Eastern emperors had legally absorbed the office of Western emperor in 476. Charlemagne's territorial legacy of unity barely survived him, his imperial project fracturing between his successors and leading to over a millennium of conflict between the lands which would go on to become France and Germany. Hardly a Pax Romana. Perhaps the area where Charlemagne can be most legitimately praised is his Carolingian Renaissance. He had artists and scholars come from across Europe to join him in his palace and devise his new curriculum and artistic style. Alcuin from York in modern England, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Einhard from the Frankish heartland, and even some Spanish and Eastern Roman artists, all bringing their own influences, their relics from the empire's height, and establishing a sense of European community and connectivity for the first time since the fall of the West. Frankish art before him was primitive and unskilled at depicting human form, with almost all objects being Germanic animal reliefs. The artistic revolution he prompted, then, was nothing short of extraordinary in rediscovering classical skill at metalwork, human portrayals, and other areas of art, and was really the first proper artistic movement Europe had seen. Despite this success, however, his artistic programme was inspired by the Anglo-Saxons and Irish as much as by old Roman styles. Here we can see two Frankish codices from subsequent Frankish rulers after Charlemagne's death. Particularly the one on the left demonstrates an enormous degree of artistic skill, which is simply unseen before Charlemagne comes to the throne. And the following tablet of North African ivory demonstrates not only skill, but that European connectivity he worked so hard for. Ultimately, Charlemagne was a strong reformer, reinforcing old Roman concepts such as the rights of the state, organised land management, if under a different system, and a road network and postal service, all of which were massively due to existing Roman influence which he helped to unearth. He also safeguarded the Roman faith and ensured Europe would remain Christian, and his receipt of the imperial title signifies the West once again rising to rival the East. In fact, he nearly married the Eastern Empress Irene. If that agreement had taken off and their lands had been joined, I think we'd have no problem in recognising him as a true Roman revivalist. All of these foederati were still Roman citizens in one way or another, and having no clear emperor was not a new problem for the West. It's worth asking the question of whether his coronation was as much some radical new departure as it was a return to old form after centuries of uncertainty. That said, a Roman successor did already exist further east, in the form of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. This was the direct continuation of the old eastern half of the Roman Empire, which never fell when the West did, and its people still referred to themselves as Romans centuries later. The empire lasted for nearly another 1,000 years, from the fall of the West in 476 until the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453. Despite this, there are claims that the Byzantines morphed into something entirely different, apart from Roman culture, in the centuries after the fall of the West, most easily exemplified by the usage of Greek as the language of the empire, rather than Latin. That said, Greek had been the lingua franca of the eastern half of the empire for centuries, during and even before Roman arrival on the scene, and this raises the question of linguistic factors in identity. If speaking Latin is a key component of being a Roman under the classical empire, for instance, is someone no longer Roman if they live the same kind of life and recognise loyalty to the empire, but speak Greek instead? Are they more Greek subjects than they are true Romans? And if so, surely this continued medieval empire is no longer Roman either. Another contributing factor to the distinction between Roman and Byzantine is their religion. Byzantium was strictly Greek Orthodox Christian, while the West was Roman Catholic. This is, however, a simplistic way of looking at religion, and these two branches may even not have been separate at the time, depending on who you asked. The history of the Christian schism is a long one, messy and full of politics, and it's almost impossible to claim that one branch is any less Roman than the other. One way in which Byzantium remained indisputably Roman was their architecture and technology. Pictured here is the Hagia Sofia, built by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, and possessing the largest unsupported dome of any church in the world. While the Westerners lived in old Roman buildings and built little of their own, the Byzantines were surpassing even the Roman classics, and the Hagia Sophia remains a world wonder to this day. Byzantine material culture also demonstrated real continuity from classical Roman tradition, in the form of mosaics, paintings, and a strong emphasis on religious artwork. The Senate continued to sit, and chariot races were still run in the Circus Maximus, remaining incredibly popular. The empire continued to be governed in a provincial system, with state-appointed governors, with a formalised hierarchy which was far more organised than the very informal system of proto-feudalism in the West, based largely around personal loyalty to the king rather than any real contract. Literacy in Byzantium was far higher than in the West, and record-keeping was far more consistent, to the point that many ancient Greek and Roman texts only survived to the modern day because of the Byzantines' work in preserving them. In fact, this concentration of knowledge in Constantinople was so high that the fall of the city in 1453 and its many refugees to Italy directly contributed to kickstarting the European Renaissance. The empire was not isolationist either, allowing the West to slip from its grasp. No, they were at times militarily involved in keeping these Western kings in line, and ensuring their tribute was in more than just words. Justinian even reconquered large swathes of Western provinces to incorporate back into the empire, if temporarily. This mosaic of Christ Pantokrator is one of the most famous examples of Byzantine art, and demonstrates a real flourishing we simply don't see in the West. Even Charlemagne's court artists can't match this brilliance. Not only is it brilliant, it continues the classical Roman mosaic tradition admirably. After the collapse of the West, we see what Paul Friedman at Yale has termed a radical material simplification, with a huge decrease in trade, an overwhelming return to subsistence agriculture, and a decrease in workmanship across the continent. Not only did this harm the cultural lives and prosperity of people, it also dragged them far closer to the poverty line. Even if the term is no longer fashionable, this period is called the Dark Ages for a reason. The city of Rome itself housed over 1 million people at the height of the empire, which by 500 AD had declined to perhaps only 80,000, less than a tenth of its former levels. It would only reach this level of population again in the early 1930s, a pattern common to many of Europe's major cities. Plus, there is still some Roman knowledge which we just haven't rediscovered, even now. Only recently we discovered that some wounds heal faster when stapled than when stitched, for instance, and the Romans seemed to know that too. Regardless of how Roman the invading barbarians may have thought themselves, and how much some of their later leaders like Charlemagne did to rediscover Roman knowledge and culture, there is no better illustration of how destructive their initial conquest was than the fate of the Colosseum, which had its marble panelling stripped to be sold and a shantytown built inside. Almost all states in Western Europe are descendants of these barbarian kingdoms. So, as we come to our end, we've taken a look at the prevailing idea of a Roman Empire completely destroyed in fire and brimstone by invading barbarians, and we can approach this with more nuance. Personally, I think the Eastern Empire is without a doubt a straightforward continuation of the classical empire, and I'd put the fall of Rome at 1453, when the Ottomans took Constantinople, rather than in 476, when the Goths took Rome itself. That said, there are good arguments to not see the Byzantines as the same thing as the Romans, with their different language and a far more Eastern cultural sphere, incorporating Syriacs, Egyptians, Armenians, and more. Even my choice of wording in this presentation was deliberate and with an agenda. Most other historians would say Byzantine instead of Eastern Roman from 476 onwards, and I made an effort to use Roman as much as possible to legitimise their position. Regardless of my opinion, there are still worthwhile questions to ask about this period, which can be useful thought experiments for thinking about other cases of change and transformation in everyday life. If many of these Germanic people were foederati, and therefore Roman citizens, how accurate is it to say that the empire was invaded, or should we say it was torn up by its own people? Can we even say that the empire was destroyed at all? The Byzantines in the East show that the definition of Roman is quite flexible, and they can pick and choose how much classical Roman culture they maintain and how much they discard as they become their own entity. If so-called Greek Romans are just as Roman as their Latin counterparts, what's to say a Frank or a Goth wasn't a German Roman? Again, many of these tribes still paid tribute to Constantinople for membership of the empire long after the fall of the West. So, as we finish today, we can ask ourselves, did the Western Empire really fall, or simply transform? How much and how quickly can we see a transformation before it's no longer the same entity? These questions have no easy answers. They've been asked since 476 itself, and they'll continue to be asked in future. But if you can approach them on your own, you'll be thinking historically.